For understanding the thought of Gabriel Marcel, the great French Catholic existentialist thinker from the early 20th century, I think that one of the best pieces to look at is this conference paper originally that gets eventually put into an essay called On the Ontological Mystery. And you can find this in its skeleton in another work called Being and Having, which I'm going to do some other videos on. There it's called the Outline of an Essay Read to the Society of Philosophical Studies, the Études Philosophiques, and he calls it then the position of the ontological mystery and the concrete approaches to it. If you get yourself the Philosophy of Existentialism volume, it's one of the essays that's contained in there. And in the earlier piece that you find in Being and Having, it's done in a very outline form without a lot of the other themes woven into it. In this work, the Philosophy of Existentialism, you have the full paper with all these different themes that are important in Marcel's version of existentialism, or as he preferred to call it, Christian Socratism, woven together, interconnected, and the two of them are not radically divergent, though. The one really is the skeleton for the other. And so in this overview part at the beginning, where I talk about some of the method and some of the key themes, I am going to read a few bits from the outline that he had as he's trying to think these things out. And I think that's important because Marcel is not a systematic thinker that has every single thing in its place, coming up with the architectonic beforehand and then figuring out where to categorize everything. And he's not the kind of thinker who develops a method and then rigorously applies that method in a mechanical fashion. Instead, what we see Marcel engaged in is the very process of, he would call it, metaphysical inquiry and discovery. And he was particularly good at this. He had a real knack for finding the right examples to reflect upon. And reflection itself is going to be a major theme for Marcel. So first let's talk a little bit, since I've already broached the subject, about what's going on in this essay, what you should expect as you're coming to it. What you've got in it is a series of analyses that are, to some degree, distinct from each other, but they blend into each other. Marcel was a thinker who was particularly enamored of music, and classical music in particular. And you can think of how musical movements oftentimes will fit into each other like pieces in a puzzle. A theme that's going to be important later on will come up a few times early on, but it's not fully worked out. It's just referred to, it's just foreshadowed, and then it becomes part of what's actually, central in another section. Marcel really is, in a lot of respects, a kind of music compositional figure or thinker when it comes to the way in which he writes. So you've got this series of analyses, and what is he doing in them? He's engaging in reflection, and that is the philosopher's activity. It's not something that is confined to the philosopher, but whenever we think about something, in French, to reflect, réfléchir, they use that for thinking about something, thinking something over. We often say mull it over, or another older form that comes actually from Latin, to ruminate upon something. Ruminatio was something that monks would do in their cells with, the books that they were reading, which might be, scripture, very oftentimes the Psalms, or they might be books written by other Christian thinkers, or other pagan thinkers, actually. The monks are the ones who conserved that. That's a whole different subject there. And they would think, they wouldn't just read to get the information in their head. They would reflect upon it. They would say, what does this actually mean? And we're going to see the importance of this. What does this mean for me? How do I fit in with this? What does it say about me, the reader, as I'm making sense out of this? Reflection is one of the things that intellectual life consists in. In philosophy, it's one of the main tools that we use. So he's reflecting on what? He's reflecting on some philosophical ideas, but he's also drawing on other raw material, so to speak. He's thinking about key insights. He's trying to cull these out and make them as clear. And oftentimes he'll say, this is not totally clear, I can't make this completely clear. As clear as can be made, these key insights that come about. And very often, they're going to be insights that Marcel himself is not going to, take credit for, but say, yeah, I'm actually talking about something that somebody else, or lots of other people, have been talking about, these important data. And then he talks about experiences. And I would also put the word examples in there as well. He tries to stick with concrete life. Why? Well, because if philosophy is really a human activity, an activity of the human person, a person that lives in time, that is connected with a world, with others, it can't be purely abstract. As a matter of fact, we make a big mistake, Marcel thinks, when we believe that we're just going to get the theory right and then apply it to all these things out here indiscriminately, as if their specificity doesn't really matter, as if there's nothing for them to tell us. He is really an existentialist in that he thinks that concrete existence has things there, has a value, has things to teach us. So he's going to reflect on those. And he's gradually moving deeper and deeper, and like I said, setting out a constellation of interconnected. At first I was going to put ideas, but really he wants to talk about real things. When he talks about hope, he thinks that if hope is merely an idea, then it's not really hope. Hope is an act. Hope is not only an act, it's an act of the person. And it involves the person with other things. That's a reality. It's very difficult to describe reality adequately, but that's part of what a phenomenologist, and Marcel was a phenomenologist, attempts to do. And what makes him, particularly existential about this is that he's willing to not try to abstract everything away and talk about some transcendental ego or every man or something like that, but to look at what is it like when we go through this? What is this day-to-day experience like? What are the dimensions of our ordinary and our extraordinary life? This is going to be the really key set of issues or distinctions in this piece. It's about the ontological mystery. So this term mystery is going to be really, really key. And Marcel contrasts mystery against problem. And when we are dealing with problems are things upon which we can bring techniques or, methods or theories to bear, and they don't really enter into us. We can approach them, as it were, from the outside, even if they have implications for us. Think about the problem of sanitation. Should we put sewers in, or just hope that people will wash the streets out themselves with their slop buckets at the end of the night? Well, that's an actual problem, and Marcel doesn't want to take away from the importance of many problems for our lives and for people, but problems are, in a certain sense, superficial. They don't get at what's most real, what possesses greater ontological weight. When we talk about ontology, what we mean is the examination or the penetration into being. And like he says in this work, being, that's not something easy to define. Really, we shouldn't try to define it from the beginning. That's something, if anything, we're going to end up with being able to define after we've done a thorough examination. But you've got this problem, or this realm of the problems, and that's where we have objectivity. That's where things are functionalized. They're turned into what we might say roles, or things that can be mapped onto each other. What he calls technics in this, or technique, fits in with that, and so does abstract thought. That, if we confine ourselves to the realm of problems, if we think that philosophy is fundamentally dealing with problems, we leave out some of the most important aspects, dimensions, experiences, realities of our human lives. And Marcel thinks that below this issue of problem, there is a kind of choice or option that is somewhat, more decisive, that involves the person in a way that the choices that might be made up here, like, how should we actually run the sewers, or how should we run these routers in this system? This concerns the person. The self, what he calls availability, is going to fit in here. And we'll talk about that momentarily. Also, fidelity, hope, and love. 3 things that he is going to engage in some analyses of. And if you know your Christian theology, you'll recognize those as faith, hope, and charity, often called the theological virtues. Marcel is taking these as data that you don't have to be a Christian in order to understand, because they really became thematized through the effect that Christianity had on the intellectual world, and not only the intellectual world, but our broader world, what we could call, if we want to be Husserlians, the life world in which we live, and worked out, new ways of being in the world, being together. And Marcel thinks that these are particularly important. So now I want to read a few passages that really touch on this. And this is from that outline available in Being and Having. He says that, and this is in section 2b. He says, I who ask questions about being do not in the first place know either if I am, nor a fortiori what I am. I do not even clearly know the meaning of the question, what am I, though I'm obsessed by it. And this is, where a lot of modern philosophy begins, with the self. Think about Descartes' cogito, right? And he's going to talk about this a bit more in the other one. And he says, we see the problem of being here encroaching upon its own data. If I'm going to inquire into being, that is not really going to be a problem, because it involves me. Problems are things that I can set at a distance from myself, that don't enter into me. If I start asking questions about, well, what am I, that perceives being, that engages with being, that poses the question of being, now we're moving into the realm of mystery. He says, in the process, this problem is denied or transcended as a problem and becomes metamorphosed to mystery. And he says, in fact, it seems very likely there is this essential difference between a problem and a mystery. A problem is something which I meet, which I find complete before me, but which I can therefore lay siege to and reduce. A mystery is something in which I am myself involved, and it can therefore only be thought of as a sphere where the distinction between what is in me and what is before me loses its meaning and initial validity. And some people might say, oh, so that's the difference between objective and subjective. Subjective, somebody's got bias or some personal involvement, and so they can't be a good observer. Marcel is actually, he would locate that at this level, and he would say that's actually just somebody approaching a problem in a bad way. Really what's going on is we're talking about a realm of matters that cannot be dealt with in the same mode of objectivity that we approach scientific issues, scientific matters with. At least when we do good science, when we don't, spill over into philosophy and call it science, the way a lot of stuff goes on doing today. When we're trying to solve problems, when we're dealing with mysteries, things get much murkier, and it's not just because we have filters or biases or something like that. It's not because things have just become subjective and everything is up for grabs. It's because unless we involve ourselves in it, and to choose not to involve oneself or to do so in a half-assed way, or to do so in a way in which one withholds oneself from it while giving at the same time, is a way of sort of denying, of betraying. And that is at a deeper level than of the problem. So we're posed with, and this is where we'll bring this to a knot so that we can start getting into the actual text. We're posed with, over and over again, this option. Do we choose what would be required in order to have being and have more of it within ourselves in our relation to other beings, which is going to turn out to be these things like fidelity, hope, and love? Or do we choose instead despair? Do we choose instead losing ourselves in this level? Do we choose instead betrayal? Do we choose instead a hardening of the self, a turning inward that denies availability and becomes what Marcel calls unavailability? Those are all very important questions, and those can only be put to a human being. Not to a book, not to a computer, not even to really an animal, unless animals develop the kind of sentience that we have, but only to a human being. And that's because we possess, and we are possessed by, whether we realize it or not, this level that lies beneath the realm of the problematic. As we begin going through this work, Marcel is going to talk about the ontological, and he's going to use this in terms of need, in terms of question, in terms of mystery. And when we see ontological, it'll be easy to do that if you're reading this, because he's always going to connect these. You want to think being, and being in the sense of something that is greater than merely the bits and pieces of your perceptions or thoughts. Being is another way of saying this, is what is real in the full sense of it. And Marcel has a lot to say here that we're going to try to run through. There's a lot of different concepts all rolled in, a lot of distinctions that he's making, and you want to try to follow out the thread of this. He actually begins by talking about the ontological sense. And he says that rather than begin with abstract definitions and dialectical arguments, I would like to start with a kind of global and intuitive characterization of the man in whom the sense of the ontological, the sense of being, is lacking, or who has lost awareness of this. And so what does he mean? He's talking about the condition of modernity for human beings. And he says that one of the things that's particularly characteristic about this is that we are identifying ourselves all too often with what he's calling functions. And he talks about two different kinds of functions here. He talks about the vital functions, and then he talks about social functions. So he says, the individual tends to appear to both himself and to others. So it's a way in which we think of other people and a way in which they think of us, but it's also something that we interiorize. It's something that we use when we make decisions, when we reflect on our own lives, on our own decisions, on our own goals, on our own failures and successes. Even our relationships we tend to think of in this way. This is a great danger. He says the individual tends to appear as an agglomeration of functions. As a result of deep historical causes, he has been led to see himself more and more as a mere assemblage of functions, the hierarchical interrelation of which seems to him questionable or at least subject to conflicting interpretations. So the individual is kind of like a bundle of different functions for different times. You know, you could think of the critique actually that Alistair McIntyre makes in After Virtue of the fragmented, compartmentalized self. And there he talks about, Goffman, this sociologist who said that really we just wear a bunch of different masks. Marcel's not talking in terms of masks like trying to deceive. He's talking about in terms of functions. And he says, vital functions, those are the ones that have to do with our body and its continuity. And, we roll a lot of things into that. So, psychology often tends to deal with these vital functions. The social functions would be, being a consumer, being a citizen, being involved with the PTA. I suppose, we could even say being a good friend if, it's done in sort of a stereotyped manner. Think about modeling your friendships after the show Friends. Which one are you? Think about these, a great example, and this is a total digression, these Facebook polls that people take, and which are awful. Usually they're just terrible construction for these from a, poll design perspective, but people take these and then they post it on Facebook. I'm a Rachel. I'm a Joey. That's a reduction of oneself to something very superficial. And many people find themselves sort of sucked into this, trapped, as it were. Marcel has some interesting examples there, but I'm not sure how well everybody will be able to relate to, going on the subway and the people who have to take the tickets or open the doors. Nowadays we have technology for that. But you could think of any sort of bureaucratized existence, whether it's that of the school, whether it's that of the crossing guard, whether it's that of the office worker, whether it's that of the person stuck in some sort of, conscript army with lots and lots of rules. There's always this danger of the human person becoming too closely identified, not only by others, but for themselves with their functions. And Marcel talks about, he says, it's true certain disorderly elements, sickness, accidents will break on the smooth working of the system. What does he mean by the working of the system? Well, you have these functions and they kind of fill in for each other. So get enough sleep so that you can get up and work, so that you can go out to the bar afterwards, with your coworkers, and then you're going to talk shop about that, and then you got to get to bed, and maybe, sleep with one of them every once in a while because that'll keep your mood up and that'll make you, able to endure the office monotony. And, we could just multiply instances like this over and over again. Those, by the way, are not the ones Marcel is using. He's, I don't think he thought quite so much about those sorts of things, but that's stuff that I think modern people can relate to. And he says, it's natural the individual should be overhauled at regular intervals like a watch. And he brings up America as a place where this often happens. Even death is, objectively and functionally the scrapping of what has ceased to be of use and what must be written off as a total loss. This is not a particularly good way to see things, is it? And Marcel now is going to draw attention to some emotional reactions to this. When you're reading this, or thinking about these things, he says it's natural to feel a sense of sadness in contemplating these. Sadness for the onlooker. What does the person who's actually involved in this sort of stuff feel? A kind of unease, which they may hide from themselves. A not being satisfied, a things being out of sorts. And he says, this uneasiness is enough to show that there is in all this some appalling mistake, some ghastly misinterpretation implanted in defenseless minds by an increasingly inhuman social order and an equally inhuman philosophy. And when he's saying philosophy there, he doesn't mean necessarily academic philosophy. He would include a lot of what we call culture and the sort of things that we share on, our Google Plus or Facebook walls, from various blogs or news sources. So long as it has to do with how people should manage their lives, or what's really going on in the brain and how neuroscience tells you about this. All of that actually is kind of philosophy. It's philosophy in the sense that Marcel is talking about here. And he thinks that there's an increasingly inhuman social order. What does he mean by inhuman? Not leaving room for what human beings really need to develop. And it's fortified, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, by an equally inhuman philosophy. So, going on, he says, it should be noted that this world is on the one hand riddled with problems. Problems as things that can be addressed, can be solved. There's techniques that can be brought to bear on them. On the other, determined to allow no room for mystery. And he says, I'm going to come back to this distinction. For the moment, I just want to point out this when it comes to problem and mystery. To eliminate or try to eliminate mystery is to bring into play in the face of events which break in on the course of existence, such as birth and love and death. And we'll come back to those in a minute. That psychological and pseudo-scientific category of the, and he puts this in quotes, purely natural, which deserves a study to itself. A study to try to analyze it and to try to help us escape from that ideology that's involved there. There is no such thing as the purely natural in the sense that a lot of people bandy it about. That's actually a construct that they put onto human things, particularly, he says, birth and love and death. These are the things that break into the cycle. And they can't be reduced to merely vital or to social functions. They have a personal import as well, an existential, a concrete import. They're relational. So he says, there exists in such a world, again we're talking about the world of these roles, an infinity of problems. And in addition to those theoretical puzzles, there's innumerable technical problems bound up with the difficulty of knowing how the various functions, once they've been inventoried and labeled, can be made to work together without doing one another harm. These theoretical and technical questions are interdependent, and these are all within the realm of problems. These are all within the realm of matters that can be addressed from an external perspective where who I am doesn't really matter to what the resolution is or what the proper take on it is. Now, he comes to talk then about the ontological need. Given all this, what happens to the ontological need? Well, what is the ontological need? He says, can we approach this directly and define it? No, not really. We have to say something like this. And here he says something, just a beautiful lapidary formula that I like very much, which is well worth reflecting on and mulling over. Being is, or should be, necessary. He says, it's impossible that everything should be reduced to a play of successive appearances which are inconsistent with each other, or in the words of Shakespeare, a tale told by an idiot signifying nothing, right? And he says, I aspire to participate in this being, in this reality. And this is a word that he's going to use over and over again. We have a choice whether to participate, or to, in one way or another, refuse. That is part of the dignity of the human being, that we're able to say yes or no to being. Now, of course, we can't make it go away, but we can refuse the parts of ourself to it. So he says, what about defining the word being? He says, well, that's very, very difficult. Let me here just try to say something like this. Being is that which withstands or what would withstand an exhaustive analysis bearing on the data of experience and attempting to reduce them step by step to elements increasingly devoid of intrinsic or significant value. Now that's quite a mouthful. What is he saying there? When we're engaged in analyses of things, we're breaking things down, we're reducing them to other things. So, analyze green. What is green? Yellow and blue, right? You've reduced it to two things. Analyze the body of an animal. Now you dissect it. Now you're doing anatomy, right? Talk about the different functions that work with each other. Now we can do this with all sorts of things. We can do this with our experience, we can do this with our thoughts, we can do this with our relations. Being is what survives that. When we analyze things, oftentimes we say overanalyze, right? But a lot of times when we analyze things, we're reducing them to things, breaking them apart, and gradually things start to lose their coherence, their meaning, their glue. They don't hold together anymore. They still have, what significance they have in themselves, but disconnected from everything else. Sort of like what Aristotle says about the hand. The hand that's cut off from the human body is really only a hand in a certain sense. It's not fully a hand anymore. And the being of things is what resists this process of dissolution. So, he says a philosophy can embrace this ontological need. That's what he's attempting to do. Or it can try to refuse this ontological need. It can refuse to endorse it. And there's two ways of doing this that he points out. One way of doing it is by sort of, suspending oneself, withdrawing from it and saying, I'm not going to pose this question. I'm going to think about other things instead. It's sort of like the, I'm not listening sort of business. And people do this, distracting themselves in all different ways. And you can do that even with philosophy. I'm only interested in this particular little problem over here in the philosophy of action. I'm not going to think about the being of the human person in general. Well, in a certain sense, you're not doing philosophy anymore. Or you're doing a philosophy that's, to use a word of Maurice Blondel, is less philosophical and more philosophy, philosophoid, kind of philosophy-like. Become detached from the ultimate moorings. It's also possible to refuse it in a much more active way. He says, there's, a bolder, more coherent approach that regards the ontological need as an expression of an outworn body of dogma liquidated once and for all. And here he talks about the idealist critique, but we could talk about, he means Kant and the post-Kantians. But we could talk about all sorts of other things. People who need to push away the possibility of there being any sort of deep meaning to existence and reject it very actively. And he says that these are an example of trying to silence the ontological need by an arbitrary dictatorial act which mutilates the life of the spirit at its roots. The person who takes on those tasks is kind of cutting themselves off from some of what it means to be human. And that's a possibility for us. You can't actually silence the need altogether. It still stays there. But you can try to push it away. You can try to suppress it. And he says, we want to now actually formulate and think about this need. So he says, what's going on when we start thinking about being? When we formulate the ontological need? It's to raise a host of questions. Is there such a thing as being? What is being? And now he notices something very interesting here. Once we start asking the question of being, who's asking? The human person, right? The human person who's motivated to ask. But now they start to ask questions about themselves. wait a second. How do I know I even exist? What kind of being am I? Am I a composite of different things? How does the way in which I am, the kind of being that I am, how does that affect the way in which I go about this study? Or does it filter out, the right grasp of what is being? Can I ever be sure about anything? And he says, you think that, here's where we start. Surely I who formulate this problem should be able to remain outside of it before beyond it, like the self is on its own outside of being. But he says, clearly that's not so. The more I consider the problem of being, the more that I find that it tends to invade the proscenium from which it is excluded in theory. It's only by means of a fiction that we can maintain ourselves as the consciousness, that's sort of independent of being. So when we posed the problem of being, the problem spilled over into ourselves. It bled over. It revealed to us that we're already in the mix with being. If we want to make a joke here, it's sort of like in those prison movies where you got a tough guy and he's put in with a bunch of other tough guys and they're starting to loom around him, and he says, you guys made a mistake. You think that I'm locked in here with you, but actually you're locked in here with me. That's what's happened, although perhaps less adversarial, with respect to being. The self has thought that it's going to investigate being, and it doesn't have to change itself or think about itself or worry about any of that sort of stuff. It doesn't have to investigate that. It'll just investigate being. And then being reveals to it that, no, you're part of this. You are actually part of the problematic. And he talks about Descartes at this point. I'm actually going to skip over this a bit. He says that the cogito really doesn't resolve the issue for us. And he says, it's a mistake to divide the question, who am I, from the ontological problem taken as a whole. The truth is that neither of the two can be dealt with separately. But when they're taken together, they cancel each other out as problems. So he says, what we're dealing with here is an urge towards an affirmation, which we're not really able to make, because we'd have to be assured of the self before we can make that affirmation. And yet, at the same time, we are making that affirmation that is going on. So he says, here what I would call the ontological status of the investigator takes on a decisive importance. He says, but so long as I'm just concerned with thought, it seems like I would follow an endless regression. But by the very fact of recognizing that endless regression, I transcend it. I see that the process takes place within an affirmation of being, an affirmation which I am, rather than which I utter. And what's going on in this section is there's this very interesting interplay between passivity and activity on the part of the subject, a sort of reciprocity within the very problematic, which is going to turn out to be a mystery, that we're looking at. The self, he says, has to be understood as subject, as choosing, as acting. But it also has to be understood as stage, where being plays itself out. And to be a stage is not to be the one calling the shots. And it's both at the same time. He says this participation cannot be an object of thought. It can only be a subject of thought. So what goes on here, he says, it'll be seen that if the meta-problematical can be asserted at all. What does he mean meta-problematical? Above it, taking it to a higher level. It must be conceived of as transcending the opposition between the subject who asserts the existence of being on the one hand and as being as asserted by that subject on the other, and as underlying it in a given sense. So what does that mean? That means that in a certain way, it's not just me who's approaching, who's staking out a position on the problem of being and the problem of my own self. Being is also doing that through my participation. It's contributing something something that I myself am not fully aware of, something that I can accept or push away as not really belonging to me, but then I lose something in the process. This is going to bring us to the distinction between the problem and the mystery that is so central to this entire essay. We now come to what is really the central focus of this work, the distinction between problem and mystery. And Marcel is going to bring up several examples to help us wrap our heads around this, and some of these are very deep, classical, philosophical issues. You notice I use the word issue here rather than problem, and you'll see why in just a moment. So, what does he tell us about problems and mysteries? He says, a mystery is a problem which encroaches upon its own data, invading them, as it were, and thereby transcending itself as a simple problem. So let's think about this just for a moment before we put anything more up on the board. Problems are things that can be examined, they can be resolved objectively. Like he says, there are techniques for addressing them. In the outline, he says, a problem is something which I meet, which I find complete before me, which I can therefore lay siege to and reduce. A genuine problem is subject to an appropriate technique by the exercise of which it is defined. So, we can have problems of sanitation, we can have problems of medicine, we can have problems of how to use duct tape. The people, this is a silly, trivial example, but the people who use duct tape to make prom dresses, that's a problem. Now, whether they should in fact do so, that's an ethical problem, as opposed to a craft problem. You can have multiple things bearing on them that are all different problems. The person who's asking the question doesn't really matter in a problem. That's part of what makes it a problem. That's what allows techniques to be able to resolve it. That's what gives it its objectivity. The fact that it doesn't matter whether I'm addressing it or whether you're addressing it or whether it's that guy over there or some scientist 500 years from now or somebody 600 years in the past. So a mystery, we could think of it initially as a problem, but that's not actually going to be adequate. But a mystery is a problem that encroaches on its own data. What does that mean? It means that it applies to what's being asked about and who is doing the asking and how they're doing the asking in the first place. The person is involved. And actually has to be engaged. Although that's a choice. That's what keeps us from actually being able to satisfactorily delve into many mysteries if we choose not to engage ourselves, if we try to treat them as merely problems. So he says, here's an example. The union of the body and the soul. The indivisible unity, always inadequately expressed by phrases such as, I have a body, I make use of my body, I feel my body, can neither be analyzed nor reconstituted out of precedent elements. It is not only data, I would say, that is the basis of data. To have a body, the dimension of corporeality, flesh, use a popular term back at that time for phenomenologists. This dimension of the body, I am not something that has a body, I am my body, and yet my body is not all of what I am. And to even ask the question requires me to be attentive to my own body as well as to other bodies, not to just engage in abstraction about bodies and spirits the way that Descartes did. He says, it's not only data, I would say it's the basis of the data in the sense of being my own presence to myself. My corporeality is the way in which I am present to myself. a presence of which the act of self-consciousness is, in the last analysis, only an adequate symbol. So this is an example of something that's not really a problem, it's a mystery. The matter that was being questioned about intrudes upon its own data. It involves the person who's doing the asking. He says, it'll be seen at once that there's no hope of establishing an exact frontier or border between mystery and problem. And he says, when we reflect on a mystery, now this is what he's going to call the first reflection. The second reflection will come up a little bit later. I'm going to discuss that in another section. When we reflect upon a mystery, we often tend to transpose it and degenerate it into a problem. He has an example for this one as well. What is it? The problem of evil. And what is the problem of evil? This is another classic philosophical issue, and it more or less runs like this. If you have God in the picture, then it runs along the lines of God is supposed to be all-knowing and all-powerful and good in every sense, so why is there all this evil? We know there's evil, because we just have to look around and we can see all sorts of instances of it. Take God out of the picture, you're still posed with a problem of evil. Why does all this crappy stuff happen? And you can say, well, chance. Well, why did chance have to go that way? There's still an intelligibility. But it really works best when you have God or even the gods. This problem does come up in Cicero as well, on the nature of the gods. Talking about polytheistic stuff, right? So he says, in reflecting on evil, I tend almost inevitably to regard it as a disorder which I view from outside, in which I seek to discover the causes or secret aims. I distance myself from the evil that I'm talking about. And if you think about the people who argue about this endlessly, they usually, you might actually facetiously say to them, yeah, I know that there's evil in the world because you're such a friggin' jerk when you actually engage in these discussions with other people that you're actually increasing the amount of evil involved in the world, both on the theist side and the atheist side sometimes. But what's going on is they distance themselves from the actual evil and they treat it as a problem. And they say, well, what's going on here? What's happening? They ask, why is it that the mechanism functions so defectively, the mechanism of the world or the person or the social order? Or is the defect merely apparent and due to a real defect of my own vision? Now, if that's the case, then the defect is in myself, but it remains objective in relation to my thoughts. Well, we're just biased if we, this is Descartes' sort of viewpoint. If we could just actually see how everything fits together in the grand world machine, we'd see that a lot of the things that we actually consider evil really aren't evil as such, and therefore God's not responsible for them. So there's an evil in us, and the evil's just a defect. We don't see everything that we ought to. So he says, evil which is only stated or observed is no longer evil which is suffered. In fact, it ceases to be evil. It kind of loses its meaning. You really want to pose the problem of evil, do it the way that Ivan does in the Brothers Karamazov, in the chapter right before the Grand Inquisitor, when he poses the problem of evil, and when you read the descriptions, you feel yourself affected by sadness, by gloom, by revolt, and perhaps even by some despair. And you are suffering evil. Not evil in the same sense as what's being suffered by the characters being talked about. But you are involved in it then. Evil is really a mystery. It's not a problem. And the more that we try to just turn it into a problem, to turn it into something other than what it really is, the less grasp we have on it, and ironically, the more we tend to replicate it. He says, I can only grasp it as evil in the measure in which it touches me. That is, in the measure in which I am involved as one is involved in a lawsuit. Being involved is the fundamental fact. I cannot leave it out of the account except by an unjustifiable fiction. For in doing so, I proceed as though I were God, and a God who is an onlooker at that. The problem of evil, if we really want to engage it, shouldn't be engaged as a mere problem. Then it just devolves into dialectics. Then you can argue whatever you like. It has to be grasped as a mystery, which means that it's not actually fully resolved. Oftentimes we have to say, I only know these things, and this is all I can say about it. So he says, this brings out how the distinction between what is in me and what is before me can break down. What goes on in a mystery is things enter into us, and we become part of the process. There's a dramatics involved there that he's going to sketch out in the later parts of this work. He says, here's a third example. Love. It's in love that the obliteration of this frontier between problem and mystery can best be seen. It might perhaps even be shown that the domain of the meta-problematical coincides with that of love. Love is somehow involved with this in an essential way. He says that love is the only starting point for the understanding of such mysteries, such as that of body and soul, or perhaps even evil. Dostoevsky, Alyosha, and his mentor, by the way, kind of hint at this, don't they? So he says, actually it's inevitable that in being brought to bear on love, thought which is not thought itself. Here I want to pause a bit. Thought that is not thought itself. Unreflective reflection. When we engage in a lot of our thinking, and a lot of our argument, and a lot of our laying out theories and making cases, we're doing something that engages our capacities, our distinctively human capacities of thought in a certain sense, but we're not being adequately reflective about what's going on with ourselves. And it's possible to reason out all sorts of things that sound completely reasonable, but upon fuller consideration, involving what the ancients called prudence or wisdom, turn out to be sorely lacking. So, unthinking thought, thought which is not thought itself, unreflected reflection. It's inevitable that in thinking about love, this kind of way of thinking about it should tend to dissolve it in terms of abstract concepts, like the will to live, the will to power, the libido. And then he said, and what he's talking about here is not just love in the self-giving agape sense. He's also talking about eros. He's talking about sexuality. He's talking about love that we have for each other, our chums, our comrades. Marcel thinks that all too often we problematize it and thereby lose sight of what it is that we're actually trying to examine. He says, on the other hand, since the domain of the problematical is that of the objectively valid, it will be extremely difficult to refute these interpretations without changing to a new ground. So once somebody decides, yeah, what we're really talking about here is just sexual desire, or the will to power, or even sentimentality, it's going to be hard to get them out of that interpretation and get them to see the deeper fabric that love actually engages us with. So he says, but I have the assurance, the certainty, and it envelops me like a protective cloak. For as much as I really love, I must not be concerned with these attempts at the evaluation. It will be asked, what is the criterion of true love? It must be answered, there is no criteriology. There is no criteriology except in the order of the objective and the problematical. Criteria belong over here. Love belongs over here. He also says that's going to be the case for fidelity and hope and despair and betrayal. He says, let's take one more example, more immediate and more particular. And he says, think about when you've met somebody. I'll just read what he says because it's so wonderful. Say that I've made an encounter which has left a deep and lasting trace on all my life. And I've had encounters like that myself. I can tell you about some of those. It may happen to anyone to experience the deep spiritual significance of such a meeting, yet this is something which philosophers have commonly ignored or disdained. Doubtless because it affects only the particular person as person. It cannot be universalized. It does not concern rational being in general. Now, before going on with his example, a little digression. Aristotle, would kind of fit into this. Although, when it comes down to his actual practice, he doesn't actually seem, along those lines. When he says that knowledge is only of the universal, a lot of people took that to mean that all we can really philosophize about is what would apply to everybody. That would be the objective. That would be the problematical. When it comes to more gripping realities, those are going to be concrete. Those are going to be particular. And so these encounters that we have, when we meet somebody and our life is changed as a result, fatefully, for good or for worse, sometimes for both, that's something philosophy really ought to pay attention to. That's something Marcel will pay attention to. He says, it's clear that such a meeting raises, if you will, a problem, but it's equally clear that the solution to the problem will always fall short of the only question that matters. Suppose I'm told, for instance, the reason you've met this person in this place is you both like the same kind of scenery or you need the same kind of treatment for your health. The explanation means nothing. Crowds of people who apparently share my tastes were in the Engadine or in Florence at the time I was there. There's always patients suffering from the same sort of thing. Neither this supposed identity of taste nor this common affliction has brought us together in any real sense. It has nothing to do with that intimate and unique affinity with which we are dealing. At the same time, it would be transgression of this valid reasoning to treat this affinity as if it were itself the cause. We want to know, where the hell did this come from? I am attached to you, and I would have never predicted that. How did this happen? We're asking a metaphysical question there. We're asking about causality. So he says, here I am in the presence of a mystery. That is to say, a reality rooted, and this is a very important point, rooted in what is beyond the domain of the problematical as such. So there is not only a distinction between these, the problematical is in a certain sense lesser than, smaller than the what is in the realm of mystery. The mysterious is what is more fundamental, more grounding. Now, what does that mean? There's some very important implications there, especially for philosophy. That means that if you want to confine yourself to what can be universalized, generalized, objectively valid, dealt with by technics, talked about as if, the person doing the talking doesn't really matter, you are cutting yourself off from being, from what is an entire realm, what undergirds all of this. That means actually you're making a decision on this side without realizing it, perhaps unconsciously, without thinking it through, to only stay over here. And like he says, culture can push you that way. The sort of damage that we undergo can push us that way. Certain natural tendencies of the kind of selves that we are push us this way. But this is where we need to go. And this is not only where we need to go personally, this is where philosophy, if it truly wants to be adequate, needs to turn its gaze. Which means that philosophy as such can't do so. Philosophers as concrete, individual, real people have to do that. They have to not only exist as philosophers, sort of abstract, weird, geeky dimension over here. They have to be involved in the very problems that they're researching, or, in a certain respect, they're falling short of doing real philosophy. So he says, I who inquire into the meaning and the possibility of this meeting, I cannot place myself outside of it or before it. I am engaged in this encounter. I depend on it. I am inside it in a certain sense. It envelops me and comprehends me, even though it is not comprehended by me. Thus, it is only by a kind of betrayal or denial that I can say, after all, it might not have happened. I still would have been what I was and what I am today. Nor must it be said I've changed as by an outward cause. It's acted on me as by an inward principle. It is part of who I am. So he says, this is very difficult to grasp without distortion. I'm always going to be tempted to react against this sense of the inwardness of our encounter. It's kind of uncomfortable. This is not a philosophy that is aimed at providing the kind of certitude that you can put before another person and say, well, you get the same thing that I get, don't you? Take a look at this form here. It's all filled in just right. It is something, however, where you can engage another person within the examination of a mystery, and you can actually become close with them by doing so. This is what, in fact, we do in, for example, reading Marcel, or reading some of these other thinkers who are particularly given to this dimension, exploring this dimension of the mystery, without calling it as such. So, we now see the distinction between problem and mystery brought out the most starkly possible in its full dimension. We've seen 4 examples, 3 of them classic examples from the realm of philosophy, one of them more novelistic, how chance meetings turn out to be quite important for us. Now we're ready to start digging into some of the other things that Marcel is going to connect up with this. Those have to do with faith, hope, and charity, understood as fidelity, hope, and love, but also with what he talks about as recollection and how all these other elements fit in with it. So we want to see how they fit into the realm of the mysterious.